Good evening, and welcome to What's Your Story? I'm your host, James Ransom Reed Jr. Let me read a couple of things to you to set the tone for tonight's show. More Americans have died from guns in the U.S. in the last 50 years than in all the wars in American history. Though the people of the United States total 5% of the world's population, they own almost half the world's guns. With well over 300 million guns in the U.S., there are more guns than people. America has also the world's most gun deaths, including homicide, suicide, and accidental gun deaths, at 105 per day, or about 38,000 a year. If you are tempted to turn off your TV and say, oh God, here we go, another liberal rant against gun ownership, you would be mistaken. I support the Second Amendment and people's right to own a gun. I do. What we're talking about is getting illegal guns and guns that people don't need off of the streets. No one is safe anywhere, not in our churches, not in our homes, not in our schools. Nobody is safe from gun violence. We don't get to put blood over the top of our doors in the hopes that gun violence will pass over our homes. That's not going to happen to us. We have to act and act now. My guest tonight is a very, very special man. His name is Bishop Jim Curry, and he's a part of a magnificent effort to get guns off of the street and convert them into useful tools that bring life instead of taking life. Would you please welcome with me the Bishop Jim Curry? Welcome to the show, Bishop.
Well, thank you for having me.
Would you please begin by telling our audience about yourself so they know who you are?
I'm a retired bishop in the Episcopal Church in Connecticut. I have worked in gun violence prevention now for about 22 years. Coming to this because of knowing victims of gun violence, families, and especially of the ripple effect that any gun violence has. It touches so many people and really shapes our communities. And so part of what I'm about is to change the conversation. As you said, this is not an issue of gun ownership. This is an issue of responsibility and the fact that we have choices that we can make. Very often, guns are stored in attics, basements, garages. They're not locked up. They're sometimes even just forgotten about. And they're there at times of potential crisis for individuals. 2/3 of all gun deaths are death by suicide by gun. The numbers you told earlier, Jim, about the amount of gun violence are a couple years old. We're talking now about 45,000 deaths a year. Suicides, accidental shootings, domestic violence, all sorts of different configurations. But the fact is that we have too many guns. And so what we do is invite people to give them up, and we'll turn them into garden tools. I came to this because of tragedies. And yet what our name and the banner that we operate under has to do with optimism. It has to do with possibility. And certainly it has to do with promise. We go back 2,500 years to the prophecy of Isaiah. And Isaiah said, they shall beat their guns into their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. We've taken that for our situation to say, they shall beat their guns into garden tools. Neighbor shall not raise up gun against neighbor, nor shall we learn violence anymore. We get to be part of that process and promise as we work at the forge to take guns that have been dismantled and transform them into garden tools and give them away to gardens in communities, churches, schools, universities, community gardens.
You told a story about what energized you to get involved so many years ago, the death of a young girl. Would you share that with us, please?
Certainly. Marcelina Delgado was a child of Hartford, 7-year-old, who was out visiting her grandmother. She was asleep in her parents' car as they delivered groceries to her grandmother. And a car came up next to Marcelina's father's car and began shooting. Her father was wounded, and a bullet hit Marcelina, who was sleeping in the back seat of the car. She died a couple days later. And we're told that that was the start of anti-gun work, anti-gun violence work in Hartford. And yet the reality is that Marcelina's death was forgotten way too soon. And she has become a symbol for me of the need for us to keep the names alive of the victims of gun violence and to remind ourselves that every single victim of gun violence deserves our attention, deserves to be remembered, and forces us to think about a future where that kind of killing doesn't happen anymore.
Who comprises the Swords to Plowshares?
Well, we are actually part of a national network of groups, blacksmiths, churches, other civic organizations. We started because this is a tangible symbol of change and possibility. In Connecticut, Swords to Plowshares Northeast was helped to start by the Episcopal Church in Connecticut and the United Church of Christ. We heard about this. We met some of the people who had been doing this work in other parts of the country, and we started working here. We have a small group of interested community members from across the state, of all denominations and faiths. And we work very closely with municipalities and with police departments across the state to do buybacks, to then destroy the guns, to have the material released to us. We have forges now in Hamden and New Haven, and we're building one in Litchfield County at this point.
I understand you actually take your demonstrations on the road to show people how it's actually done. Would you explain a bit about that, please?
Exactly. We have a wonderful trailer that was given to us partly as a gift, partly from donations. And we're able to take our full forge, which is a self-contained unit powered by propane, so it's not an open flame. Fire marshals like the idea that it's not an open flame. And we're able to go all over the East Coast. We've been to Washington, D.C. 4 times. We do a lot of work in Massachusetts, communities across Connecticut, Northeast, Southwest, and in Massachusetts, most especially. Last year, we were able to get up to Maine, and in 2 weeks, we'll be in Brattleboro, Vermont. And in each case, what we do is set up the forge, the anvil, the hammers and tongs, and we invite people to come and beat the guns. It's especially important for people who have experienced gun violence, because in these demonstrations and as they help to transform the metal of that gun into a garden tool, they're taking control for themselves. This instrument of potential death does no longer have power over them. They have the transforming power over it. And over again, I'm told that. Whether it's a teenager or a 90-year-old, there's a sense of empowerment. And it really focuses on this sense that we have choices in our lives. And one of the choices is to work for a community of peacefulness.
Could you speak to the myth that gun violence happens only in certain communities, in certain neighborhoods? My understanding is that no one is safe from gun violence, no matter what community you live in. And if you look at the news, you would see that that's true. Would you concur?
I do concur. The most visible aspect of that is in domestic violence. And in Connecticut, we've had horrific examples of that over the last few years, where unsecured, unlocked gun in a home has been the instrument of death and tremendous injury in the midst of an argument in domestic violence. The other thing, and I go to communities all over almost every week to speak to this and to bring the forge out to people. Over and over again, people will tell me about the incidents of suicide in their own families. That's a hidden reality. We don't talk about suicide very often, and yet every church community will know someone. Every family will probably have somebody within their history that's committed suicide, often by gun. And a hidden component of this, and very important for the work of Swords to Plowshares Northeast, is that veterans are taking their lives by gun at a huge rate at this point. And so the issues of support for veterans and their families, the issue of more institutional supports for people coming out of situations where their lives have been determined by organized violence, the military. We need to be much more aware of the kinds of power and influences they've had on their lives.
I see you have some demonstrations for us. Do you explain to the viewing audience what those are?
Sure. These are two of the kinds of tools we make. We call this a mini-mattox, and the mini-mattox is made out of a rifle barrel. We'll take a 7-inch slice of a rifle barrel, and using blacksmithing techniques, we'll heat it up. The forge doesn't melt the metal, it just makes it soft enough to pound into shape. And we'll make this two-edged tool. It's a wonderful little garden tool, hand tool, with a little hoe on the one side and a little cultivator on the other. This tool is made from a shotgun barrel, a trowel, and once again, what we'll do is cut a slice from a barrel. We can also do this with large handguns, but most of the material we work with are long guns. And we'll prepare it by cutting it with a metal saw and then shaping it on the anvil with hammer as it's heated in the forge. And then we make the handles that go with them, and we give them away. we're always looking for gardening groups, especially groups work with seniors and with disabled persons and with youth, to give these tools away and to tell the story that this is made out of a gun that might have been an instrument of harm, but that is now turned into an instrument of cultivation and nurture.
Do you have any idea how many guns have been turned in since your involvement, that you were involved in your organization? Just a ballpark figure?
Oh, my goodness. We've worked with cities of New Haven, Bridgeport, Hartford, Hamden, Norwalk, the towns of Guilford and others over the last 4 or 5 years. We've had hundreds of guns turned in. Gun buybacks are a good way to invite the community to take an assessment of the guns they have in their homes. Was talking to somebody just today who has knows a woman, a widow, who has 7 guns in her house, and she wants to give them up to the police department and wants them to be part of our program as they're destroyed and then made into gardening tools.
Now, when people turn in their guns, it's no questions asked, you just turn them in?
That's correct. All of our buybacks are, and in other states, sometimes they're givebacks. But in Connecticut, we're tied to buybacks of giving away. As people turn in their guns, we'll give them a gift certificate, a gift card, or something of value, so that there's an exchange there. But it is anonymous, and that's an important thing, so that people can be free to really assess giving up the gun. The guns are then tested by the police departments to make sure that they're not part of any crime before they're given to us. But they are not using the information of the person who turned in the gun. That's an anonymous reality. We then ask people to do an anonymous survey, because one of the things I'm told often is that gun buybacks make no difference. We're trying to get now, and we're starting to get, survey information, real data that's showing that gun buybacks affect real change when it comes to suicide and injury. We have yet to figure out the best way to get guns in off the street. But the gun that is in an unsecured home is also the gun that's going to be targeted in a burglary and will make its way into street violence. And once again, I want to really underscore the fact that most gun deaths are not around street violence. The police in Hartford and New Haven and Bridgeport will tell you that's a very small segment of the harm and deaths that come from gun violence. And more and more, they know who are doing those acts of violence in the streets. And there are more and more techniques to help control that.
Are you a 501c3?
Yes.
And
we are. So
people can contribute to you? Is that part of how you get funded?
Exactly. And we do sell some of our tools, especially when we're coming out to demonstrations, like the one we're going to have at
Avon.
A Congregational Church in Avon.
And that's a pretty snazzy sweatshirt you're wearing there. Where would we find one of those?
Well, we haven't started selling these yet.
Okay.
Yes, we haven't started selling them. They're pretty dear in terms of cost.
I got you.
But people do understand that our work is volunteer, and we need funding from community sources in order to keep this going. And of course, this sweatshirt is an advertisement
Absolutely.
for what we do. And if I might just stand up and turn around.
Watch your mic. Yeah.
For a second.
Okay. All right. Okay.
We are about transformation. And what we've discovered is, as we transform these weapons, we're also transforming the hearts of people who are involved in this movement.
What's one of your more moving moments that you've been involved in this?
The first time I got to put a saw to a handgun was in New Haven after a gun buyback. It was our first time, and we had gotten the help of a metal sculptor in New Haven, and we used his backyard as a place to dismantle these guns under the supervision of the police department. And taking the saw to a gun that might have harmed somebody was just a moment of absolute joy. And thinking beyond that to the transformation of what is possible to the tool, to the individual, and to the community because of this kind of work.
Would you explain to people how they can get involved with your organization and what they can do to help?
Yes. Look in your newspapers and be alert to where we're going and when we're going to be.
Do you have a website?
We do. It's s2pnortheast.org. And it will have our calendar on it. We're someplace every week, starting next week, the week after Easter. And all our demonstrations are open to the public. They're absolutely free. And what we want to do is have people participate. We haven't decided on an Avon date yet.
We're working on it.
But we will. And it will be an opportunity to really have a hands-on experience.
To get guns off of the streets, to preserve people's lives, to bring stability and sanity back. What I have found, much to my dismay, is that many people have resigned themselves to the fact that this is the new norm and we should accept it. To that I say no. I say no because I'm a Christian, and because, as Robert Kennedy used to say, some men look at things and say, why? I dream things that never were and say, why not? We do not have to accept the fact that guns will rule our lives and our society. We just don't have to accept that. And somebody said, perhaps you know who it is, that if you have faith the size of a mustard seed, you could say to the mountain, move, and the mountain will move. Do you know that fella?
Somebody said that. And that person was executed. And the cross was for that time what the gun is for now. And to speak as a Christian, what God did with the cross is to destroy it and reshape it and transform it, as we're doing with guns, and making it into the sign of greatest hope. So that's what our tools are. It's the transformation from violence to hope.
Wow. I hope you've enjoyed and learned something from tonight's presentation. That's all the time we have with Bishop Curry, and I'm sure we'll get him back in the future. Meantime, go to his website, see what you can do to help get guns off of the streets. It's an imperative that we act. We don't need to continue to discuss and talk and debate. We need to act. Please act. You're saving your lives as well as your fellow man. This is What's Your Story? I am your host, James Ransom Reed, Jr. Everybody has a story. Until next time, what's yours? Good night.
The water's warm at Jaws Pond, and we're stocked full of treasures. Big or small, we buy it all. We buy and sell fast rides, power tools, vintage guitars, and so much more. Walk the plank in style with our fine jewelry, diamonds, and watches. Plus, we have a huge selection of the latest video games, including the new PlayStation 5 and Xbox Series X. Jaws Pond, conveniently located on Meriden Waterbury Turnpike in Southington and West Main Street in New Britain.